My name is Paul Nunesdea. I'm a certified professional facilitator from the IAF, which stands for International Association of Facilitators. Since 2018, I've started a book series on architecting collaboration, and my latest book, in co-authorship with Martin Duffy and other renowned digital facilitators and guest co-authors, is titled Beyond Virtual Meetings. It's all about the importance of the digital tools that can extend and augment the power of you as a facilitator and a meeting host in virtual online meetings, but also on the hybrid meetings that are going to be so much needed in this post-pandemic era. Along with my co-author Martin Duffy and esteemed PhD colleague, we host Talk to Your Meeting Doctors, a series of hosted conversations with meeting experts that can advise you about how to transition to this new normal and take advantage of this incredible once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make the organization of your meetings more sustainable and effective. Please stand by as the next show will start momentarily.
But as Paul was there, he was a witness to this great event.
Absolutely, Kate. And we're going to talk about it. This is a soft starting to our recording. And welcome, everybody, viewers that are following us. It's really a pleasure to be you again in our recently revamped Artstream studio. Here with me, I have, as always, my co-host, Martin Duffy.
Hello, folks. Nice to be here again.
And today with another special guest. And we are just talking about Keith Jones' recent achievement. Keith, perhaps before we start, Martin has a question that we normally pose to all our guest speakers.
Let's hear it then, Martin.
Yeah, we generally like to ask people, Keith, if there's any particular aspect of their present, past that generally people would not be aware of or not familiar with, that you'd be happy to share with us.
Okay. Yes, something in my recent past that I think is probably most pertinent to me is taking over the care of my parents. Actually, that is probably one of the most significant events of noticing the shift in dynamics, so that as I'm still blessed to have them both with me, both in their mid-90s.
Wow.
And just recognizing the change in the dynamic from the days when, I was a small boy being cared for by my parents, and now I'm very much in the position of having to arrange for and set up all the necessary care for them. So that's been a really interesting shift for me, both in my perspective of who I am and my place in the world. You wouldn't know that just by looking at me.
Oh, geez. And they're mid-90s. That's a fantastic age to have reached together. Wow.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that will be a tough one, Martin. How to segue on these to the topic that brings us here together?
Well, and just before we went on air, Paul, we were just talking about grandchildren, and I was just reflecting. I'm just coming from having met my new grandson, just 4 days old.
Yeah.
And Keith, you're reflecting on your parents at the other end of that life cycle of 95 years, which is, we all live in that circle of life a little bit, don't we?
We do. And I think that, that's the thing that is just so remarkable, isn't it? Is that there's both a predictability and an unpredictability about the cycle of life that we live through to the greater or lesser extent. In our quest for certainty for those people that seek that.
Absolutely. But for our dear viewers, we are in Talk to Our Meeting Doctors special summer episode, as we keep tracking of episodes, but after 4 years, it's no longer mandatory to have them by sequence. This is going to be a summer episode. And Keith Jones, our guest, let me just tell you, is an accomplished author. He wrote a fantastic book that I was lucky enough to receive at home as a token for appreciation on my participation on a workshop with Keith, Transform 8. This is an incredible masterpiece on advanced executive coaching and facilitation, because it's a blend, actually, what you do, Keith, isn't it? You're
Yes.
advancing facilitation towards executive coaching, and that's probably something that connects with this cycle of life that you also have on your book theme, right? And the Transform 8 principle, you know.
Oh, yes.
Maybe you could expand on it a little bit, and then Martin could jump in with some questions.
Sure.
I'm sure that will come up.
Well, I think that the thing that was so both surprising and profound about the writing of that book, the book was called Provoke, the Art of Transformative Facilitation, is that it was really an evolution from many years spent as a clinical and forensic psychologist and qualified psychotherapist, and that migration into organizational life, and working on an assumption, I think a naive assumption, that much of what I studied at postgraduate level in those previous professional fields was immediately transferable. It wasn't. And I think that was one of the biggest areas. But what it did show up for me was the tangible gaps in organizational learning, and particularly from a leadership development perspective, of what I saw were gaps in our understanding of human development and human change, and the naivety that was attached to that. And so that the book that I wrote was, it wasn't written necessarily to challenge the orthodoxy of facilitation. It was written specifically as a means to extend the framework, the parameters of what is possible in adult learning. So I think that, and that was the bit that got it to the Best Business Book of the Year in 2020 as a finalist.
Wow.
And it's inspiring, Keith, to see how you take the principles of Asian management knowledge towards your book. You know, the principle of the circle. And that's interesting, because Martin was talking about the circle of life. So, is there a different perspective the 21st century is begging all of us to take on life and on purpose and on organizational goals? Could we reframe, rethink everything?
I think to a large extent, the inclusion of the Enzo was both by design and by practice as a 40-year practicing Zen Buddhist. And so it was particularly poignant to me. And one of the things that I found so profound, particularly in the travels, because I've had the privilege of working, as you know, Paul, in 48 countries now, is the profound simplicity that is enshrined in much of the writing, not just from a Buddhist perspective, but from many other philosophical discourses that shed light on the complexities that we face today. And it was profound. I only come back from Saudi Arabia yesterday morning. And having been there working with the heads of the banking industry in Saudi Arabia, it is both profound and inspiring to notice how they interweave Islamic discourse and Islamic wisdom into the practice of modern day business when talking about AI-generated fintechs that are yielding billions of dollars worth of revenue with no employees. I mean, it's so, you know, these juxtapositions I just find both bewildering and wonderful to observe.
That's interesting.
A way to go, Martin.
The one of the things that the theme or the topic, Keith, that we had suggested to you for our discussion, and we're not wedded to it. We can go wherever the conversation takes us, but central to that theme that we offered was drawing a distinction between theory and practice. The concept of what we, like, the three of us have gone through the rigors and detail of researching PhDs. And at one level, it calls on a lot of academic, intellectual rigor and detail. But there's a completely flip side, which is the whole area of practice and practice experience. And mindful of some of your background, Keith, that I wasn't aware of before we met just literally 10 minutes ago. Such like your clinical psychology in Zen Buddhism and being a practitioner for, I believe you said at least 20 years, or was it 40 years? 40
years.
And then you mentioned the interactions between Islamic discourse and AI banking business, which you know, if we take ancient, so is Islamism and its ancient history and deep roots, and we take AI, which is just barely out of the cradle. You'd argue and say, well, it's not even out of the cradle. It's we still don't know where it's going to go. Theory versus practice mapped onto just those introductory comments, Keith, that you've given us. I'd be fascinated to hear your reflections on and your experience of theory versus practice in any of those areas.
I could come on two ways. I'll do the latter one first, because it's the one that I find the most profound. There are a multiplicity of ways that we can look at the inclusion of AI in executive learning, as we stand it right now. And one of the most powerful that I was offered recently was in a conversation with an AI platform, where the AI platform spoke of itself as an extension of human understanding. And the way that it encapsulates itself, which I found remarkable, was it used the words to say, I am an extension of you. My knowledge is an extension of you. I am no different in that context, but an extension of you. Now, when I think about that, and I think about in some ways, the profundity and the implications of that, and then I contrast that with the application of psychological principles in adult learning, I think one of the things that became so profound in my practice as a facilitator is the degree to which it's possible to compress the theory and practice together. And that, I find, uniquely is both embodied and richly amplified at the points where it touches the human being. So it actually is not a cognitive exercise in itself. It is far more an experiential exercise. And the best way that I can describe that would be through the use of improvised acting, or improvised direction. And when you think a bit of improvisation, let me give you a tangible example. There's one program that I'm involved in with a Big Four consulting firm, with a global lead partner participant. So they're very experienced in a multiplicity of different industry sectors. And the whole program is predicated on their ability to work with a very complex business issue, but actually that being live with 5 representatives from the industry, so that everything that they're talking about in terms of objective setting or capability development actually is a manifestation of the relationship that they develop and the embodiment of those skills that come from that conversation. What's intriguing about that from a facilitation perspective is that it provides it provides me and it provides my colleagues with the raw material of human interaction, the raw material of the encounter, the raw material of human contact, both at the level of need and at the level of want. And that is as far away that you could get from what I would see in my practice and in our business as traditional learning and development, you know, the production of slides, going through a series of applications and ideas and people reflecting on them and coming out the end. It is as far removed from that as you could possibly imagine. That is those are the big differences.
And again, you're provoking multiple questions immediately from the get-go in my mind here. When you mention human learning and you mention facilitation, you're mentioning them in the same breath.
Yes.
So facilitation, from your perspective, is facilitation about learning, or is it about something other than learning, or is learning a byproduct of the facilitation?
That's brilliantly put, actually, Martin, because the objective would be, if I were to describe it, is not actually about the learning at all. The big distinction between the two is that the facilitation process is about creating a context within which direct experience shows up for the individual. The consequence of that direct experience will be whatever is important for that person. And so creating the context within which the experience shows up is a very different form of facilitation than going through a series of objectives, and these objectives would lead to a particular subject matter, and we would discuss that and then go through some various applications. It's not that at all. It is the complete antithesis of what will be considered traditional learning processes in adult ed, particularly exec ed.
Yeah, because that just logically, then what you say there just logically provokes me back to the client perspective. So when the client comes looking for facilitation, does the client explicitly come looking for ultimately some learning as a byproduct, or do they start off looking for facilitation to meet one need, their perceived need because we don't get on or we have difficulty communicating, some of the traditional things we might hear, versus at the end of that process, do the clients reflect on it and go, oh wow, I got something really different out of that facilitation than I went in expecting. What's your experience of that?
I think that the experience has matured over time. People that I now work with, people that know me and have known me, many of the people that I work with from a client perspective, I've worked with for over 20 years. And so they are very familiar with, stylistically, with the way I work.
Okay.
What you're talking about, if we go back to the very beginning, and I think you raise an interesting point about the distinction of being, of creating learning pathways with very clear objectives, very clear learning outcomes. That for me is about the business of learning. And I would want to make a distinction between the business of learning and the practice of learning. And I see them as very different entities. If I think about the business of learning, and I think about going back some years where I used to head up for KPMG, the learning and organization development function for EMA, Europe. So I was immersed during that period and then subsequently in business schools with a very traditional way of applying executive education. And what I was left with were a series of metrics about the outcomes of learning that were quite simply unachievable within the context of the structure that was put together. Let me give you an example of that. An example of that would be a whole group of people in a senior leadership process. And what we want by the end of day 4 is for them all to be charismatic and influence their team to create greater P&L. It's ludicrous. It just simply does not work that way. And then you get to the end of this with the traditional dance of, so what did you learn and what are you going to do differently on Monday morning? No. No, it just doesn't pan out that way. Unfortunately, people go back to their day jobs, and what is remembered is remembered, and forgotten is forgotten. So when I talk about creating the context of learning, I think part of that agenda is to create a context within which the individual associates their learning at the level of meaning. Because whenever when I wrote Provoke, I must have interviewed, I don't know, probably about 300 C-suite from around the world in different industries. The thing that was so profound about those interviews was that not one person mentioned a leadership development program. Not one person mentioned a postgraduate degree as being instrumental in shaping their identity to be the person they are today. It was often about unrelated, random experiences that they weaved together in the cycle of their life to make sense of how they do the things that they do. And if you were to break those down, they wouldn't seem to be relatable. So when I talk about creating the context of experience, that is about creating an environment in which that place of meaning comes to the surface. What the individual then takes from that is what's going to be most useful, what's going to be most interesting and most useful to them to engage them in a relationship with themselves. And that's a very different process. It's very difficult to create business cases around instructional design that articulate that in that way. That's a real challenge.
Yeah, and when you've just the last 2 points that you've just made there conjured in my mind the really old traditional Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it immediately smacked into my mind the self-actualization as the ultimate part of that pyramid, that when all other needs are met, right there at the top. And have we cut to the chase?
I think there's a fair point to although when you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's actually imaged as a pyramid. I'd actually invert it, because the actualization experience, the process of embodiment, is how we bring you closer to you in that expression of experience. And I remember, and Paul, you may remember this, one of the things that I looked at in my doctoral thesis was the process of expansion of being, which actually doesn't have anything added to it or taken away, but is the expansion of the essence of the individual into the space that always exists as a possibility, but whether someone is prepared to step into it is a different issue. So when I think about facilitation, and I used the phrase in my thesis of what was known as the trickster healer, the provocateur on the edge and the boundary between what's right and what's not right, the point that takes the individual from the space of known into the space between what is known and what is unknown, and hold them there. And I think that's one of the great challenges of facilitating in this space, is that in order to do that, I or another or someone operating from this particular perspective would need to step into that space with them. So there is a relational dynamic that comes from a sense of self of the facilitator, in addition to the delegate or the group that is sitting in front of you, so that those fictitious boundaries that are held, that we create in many occasions, dissolve. And then you end up, and I love the word at the beginning of this, I don't know whether it was you, Martin, or you, Paul, that said it, it becomes a symbiosis. And it is a symbiotic experience in a functional sense, not a dysfunctional sense.
So can I put something a little bit provocative?
the spirit
That's
of
the title of the book, Provoke.
in the spirit.
This isn't necessarily just provocative towards you, Keith. This is possibly a little bit more provocative towards our audience, Paul. The traditional view, and Paul and I have had numerous this series around what I'll call traditional facilitation, and the idea of facilitating workshops and being engaged for facilitation purposes, and so on and so on. But to my ears, Keith, your concept of facilitation is radically different, actually, I think, to the traditional notion of facilitation. You mentioned earlier that where you've just come from a body of work in Saudi Arabia, and you've mentioned that you've worked across 48 different countries. You've mentioned an extensive number of high-level executives that you've interviewed in preparation for the book that you published in 2020. The idea of facilitation and the idea of engaging facilitation now conjures potentially two very different perspectives. One is if we do traditional organizational facilitation in the meeting context, which is the area that Paul and myself are particularly interested in, we say we conjure a really traditional view of facilitation.
Sure.
But if we take facilitation in the personal development space, if we take facilitation in the self-actualization space, we are now talking about a radically different concept of facilitation and therefore practice of facilitation. But where I'd like to pose the question to you, Keith, is that latter point that I've just made about the person versus where the person as the chief executives or the A-suite execs, where their aspiration for the organization, which is my first point about traditional facilitation, how do those two versions of facilitation then come together to serve the individual and the organization?
Yes,
or do they?
Yes, they do. And I think it's a fabulous question because it brings to the surface and amplifies something very significant, I think, about the distinction of transformative facilitation. And I use this term advisedly, as when I began to originally conceptualize and create a distinction around transformative facilitation, it is as an extension of what, and this is only an assumption, Martin, that I'm going to make from what you said, from the assumption of traditional facilitating practice, that ability to be engaging, to work on a clear agenda, to get to clear outcomes. And all of this is predicated on the degree of contract. So what I'm suggesting to you, in certainly stylistically, in the way that I often now are commissioned to work, that is only done on the basis of a clear, understood contract between myself and the client. I don't go there without permission. It isn't something that I would, these poor delegates come into the room and wonder what on earth they've walked into. Oh my gosh. And I have to confess, as many of us who have been in this profession for a number of years, I've come to this as much on the mistakes that I've made as to the things that have worked well. And so that central axiom of great facilitation practice remains. So what I'm suggesting, or what I'm offering, is to say that those boundaries are in many ways artificial. There is as much outside of those boundaries as an opportunity for delivering value to the clients as there is within them. And we limit that value either by retaining our identity based on an orthodoxy of practice, rather than the orthodoxy of practice being an embodied skill that comes through us, that in order to move into that space requires the Martinness of Martin to step into the frame.
Love that.
to step into the frame.
I love that.
Then it becomes a different story. And just before I finish my discourse on this, this is where it moves from the facilitator to, if you've ever seen improv directors work in theatre, it's closer to that. It's closer to those moments where they build an improvised moment, almost from in a psychodramatic way, where the people become clay. They are molded into an environment that creates a different experience. That's an incredibly vibrant place to facilitate from.
I just wonder again. You've caused a whole lot of things to flash into my mind. You know, I'm thinking of Mintzberg's concept of molding strategy. So if we take organizations, and the classic view of organizations driven by business schools is around strategy and strategy development and strategy formulation and big grandiose implementations of those strategies. And Mintzberg's notion of strategy was around the idea that you don't create it, you mold strategy. That was one thesis that he put forward. You know, or you take you take other practitioners of strategy who have a really formulaic way of propositioning it. But what you're suggesting here, Keith, if I'm interpreting it correctly, is that we can have all of that textbook learning that we want. But actually, when we put the people in the room, the boundaries between the people and the organization now start to get very blurry.
There you have it. Absolutely spot on.
Yeah. Yeah. So therefore we're the notion of organization then, and I'm trying to reflect this now back to the concept of facilitation, which is kind of central to our conversation here. The idea of organization, the engagement of facilitation as a tool or as a medium or as a vehicle for transforming the organization is as much predicated on facilitation of the individuals for personal transformation as on facilitation for organizational transformation. Would I therefore be correct in saying that if organizations, and I'm now addressing this to our executive suite colleagues out there, if we're to think in terms of organizational transformation, we must start by thinking in terms of personal transformation, and then let the organizational transformative journey go where it wills. Would that be a fair conclusion?
I think that would be incredibly fair. And what I would add to that is that it's often about Christopher Bolus wrote a brilliant book. He's an object relations psychoanalyst, but he wrote a brilliant book whose title I loved, and it was called Speaking the Unthought Known. And to a large extent, the role of the facilitator in those moments is to provide that container rather than context, but the container within which the speaking of the unthought known is expressed. And, what happens organizationally, in some cases, depending, I think it does depend on sector culture as well. So, if I were to think about operating in this way within areas of central government, I would have some pretty serious questions, largely because of the institutional cultures. If we think of some of the big organizations that I've been involved with, such as the Law Society, it does not operate contextually in that way. When you move or you migrate out of those areas that have very tight governance or very tight regulatory compliance, and you shift it into some of the other areas, then you see the organizational structure or the cultural manifestation emerging from the individuals that changes as a consequence of their ability to be in contact with what's real. to be in contact with what's real, organizationally, relationally, between those members of the executive structure. If I think about that from an example perspective, one of the things that I get involved a lot in is the facilitation of mergers and acquisitions. M&A work, you guys, I'm sure, have been around that, will know the moment when all the legal stuff is done, when all the governance and structural stuff is done, and you bring together in the room the two boards, and there's only going to be one CFO at the end of this, and there are two in the room. And you've got that multiplied. It's the ability to create, from a facilitation perspective, the container that holds that incredible energy. And that's as much to do with making transparent all that sits below the table as that which is on the table.
Yeah, but Keith and Martin, reminding of the time we have left, because we could be here for hours. The conversation is amazing. So far, I saw how Martin brilliantly unpacked a complex work that Keith offers to his clients and his client base throughout the world. This was brilliantly unpacked by you, Martin, and it's true that Keith is doing something really innovative in terms of facilitation. He calls it transformative facilitation. But my question is really, how inseparable is the facilitator from the practice, right? Because is it what you do repeatable by others that do not have your clinical psychology background, your life experience? Is this a transferable process, Keith?
Yes.
Because this is the theme here, right? Theory and practice, right?
Yeah.
So how can I take your theory and make it my practice?
In answer to your question, the second book that I'm now writing, Paul, you'll have to read that one. I will be in that.
I mean, I'm expecting you to be myself.
I'm expecting it to be there. I thought you probably would.
It's okay.
In answer to your question, yes, it is, but it's actually to do more with the ability that you're right. First of all, the facilitator is not separate from the practice, from the individual, so that the embodiment of the two, the symbiosis, the synergy between the individual being the mechanism, the conduit through which this process takes place, is where you cease to be the facilitator, but the facilitation practice is a direct manifestation of your ability to be in that space with those delegates and with those people. It is the expression of embodiment. And I think that what you're talking about, which is a whole other area, although it's the feature of this, is that subtle transition between theory and practice, about the point when the individual becomes so immersed in their practice that it becomes muscle memory and ceases to be a thought activity of what you're going to do next. So it's like Martin playing the guitar. If there are tunes that you can play without even thinking about the chord structure. We both know it. We both know what muscle memory is. It's the same thing.
Amazing.
Wow. And there's a final provocative thought, and maybe this is for another conversation, gentlemen. That we talked there about separating the facilitator from their practice of facilitation.
Yeah.
But there's an extension to that, which is the separation of the facilitator from the outcome of the facilitated event or events.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's perhaps that's a further piece of reflection that could be beneficial, Paul. Maybe we could chalk that down as a follow-up conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, when we enjoyed our conversations, Keith, we invite our guest speakers for a second program. So you are being kindly invited to a second program, as we need to wrap up this one right now, right, Martin?
we are, yeah. But as we said, Paul, or Keith, sorry, we typically try to limit ourselves to 45 minutes. And we tried to do a 2-minute wrap-up summary. So I tried to do a little whirlwind of where our conversation took us. we started our conversation, Keith, with just a short reflection by yourself on your background. And the diversity of that background provoked us into conversation about the idea of executive facilitation. And you gave us example of work you've recently done mapping the executives facilitation with AI and how AI might interact or interface with that facilitation process. You mentioned the idea of improvised acting as a tool to enable individuals to become a kind of aware, I suppose, of what the outcome of facilitation practice might possibly be. You emphasized the idea of human contact, and you mentioned needs versus wants, which is a theme in its own right that we could explore quite separately another day. But going to the heart of facilitation, I asked about the distinction between learning as a byproduct versus learning as a prerequisite or a pre-requirement as an output from facilitation. You suggested that from the client expectations of facilitation, you drew a distinction between business of learning versus the practice of learning. And that took us into a kind of a segue into self-actualization. When we mentioned Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and this idea that through facilitation, the real question is, what are we doing on behalf of our clients? But that equally then brought us to say, who's the client? Is the client the organization? And are we facilitating transformation of the organization? Or are we actually really facilitating transformation of the individuals? And through that transformative process, we are therefore facilitating transformation of the organization. Keith, I think it's fair to say you strongly leaned towards saying, yes, it's the transformation of the individual is really a key foundational stone to transformation of the organization. That forced us to look at it from the boundaries perspective, to say personal versus organizational, and where those boundaries might lie, and the role of the facilitator in helping the individuals to discern where those boundaries might be. Part of what you suggested to us as foundational to facilitation is to create that context in which the participants can safely explore what those boundaries actually are and what they mean. But that caused us to say separating facilitation from the person of the facilitator. So there's a theme or a topic, we didn't get to explore it in detail, but it begs a question. And it begged a follow-on question, which I suggested at the very end, to say, so the separation then of the facilitation stroke facilitator from the output of the facilitation process. And both of those final points might be worthy points to explore in a follow-up conversation.
I would be delighted to.
Absolutely.
As much as I can do to hold on to actually get into coming back on that, but you were right to bring it in, Martin. Brilliant.
Absolutely. So, dear viewers, here you are. We have just unpacked part one of our interview with Keith Jones. As a former CEO, I cannot help to recommend Keith, because sometimes I think about my career as a CEO when I was leading almost 100-person organization. I wish I had Keith by my side, because these frontiers between individual and organization are really, really at the core of what you as a chief executive can deliver to your organization. And with that said, Martin, Keith, let's postpone this conversation then to the next episode, probably in August, if you are willing to join. And our viewers, you have to stick with us in August in order to
find the answer to the next
find out the answers to the fascinating conversation with Keith Jones, author of Provoke, and recently graduated as a doctorate in this subject, right? Because Keith is actually putting a stakeholder in this field, fascinating field. Thank you so much, Keith. Martin, over to you. Final goodbyes.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Yeah, thank you very much, Keith. Fascinating conversation, and you know, there's a bit like a fire hose. There's an awful lot more to get out of it than we got with the initial glass. So thank you very much indeed for a most engaging and a most interesting.
You are
discussion.
both very welcome, and Martin, congratulations again on your new grandchild.
Yes, true. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, fantastic.
Good one.
Thanks a million.
lot.
Thanks then.